Welcome to the Activate World podcast, a series on how business leaders have more power to solve societal issues than any elected official. We explore business activism with substance and depth of thought. We're excited to have Professor Jennifer Petersen with us from the University of Virginia. She is the author of Murder, the Media, and the Politics of Public Persuasion, and is also working on a second book called How Machines Came to Speak: Media Technologies and Freedom of Speech. Professor Petersen, welcome to Activate World.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Before we get started, give us a little background on who you are, what you teach, and any other interesting things you'd like to share.
I research in general intersections of media law, and affect is another area of interest, which is probably less relevant to our conversation today. And I teach at the University of Virginia in the Department of Media Studies. I teach on the history of documentary film, news analysis, history of media and media technologies, and free speech law.
That's great. So obviously a lot of changes in our society today as it relates to media with social platforms and other struggles that go with that. I know radio is one of the areas that you have focused on. Could you give us some history on radio back in the 20s and 30s and how it began to unfold?
So radio arrived on the scene for most Americans in the 1920s. It had been around a while technologically before that, but it had been used more as a point-to-point communication where hobbyists were using it to speak to one another, kind of like a walkie-talkie or shortwave radio today. So it was something that was associated with young men, technology that young men used to talk to each other. And as a lot of historians have pointed out, there are a lot of similarities between the way that journalists talked about these young men in the teens and the way that we talked about hackers in the 90s. So they were seen as a little bit of troublemakers and, kind of odd fish. But in the 1920s, radio's really changed. The radio sets became much more consumer friendly, and you started to have these furniture-like radio receivers, which is really different, obviously, from what these hobbyists had before that, which were both receivers and transmitters. So radio became more of a consumer technology. You would, in the 20s, and this is, you go to a department store and you would buy a radio receiver. Mm-hmm. And that meant that this was open to anybody. You could put it in your living room. And the second important thing that happened was you began to have various different groups of people creating radio broadcasts on a regular basis. So the person who bought this radio receiver would have something to look for, a radio station to look for. And they would tune in the station and listen to it. And some of the first radio stations were, in fact, equipment manufacturers and sales companies that were selling the receivers. So Westinghouse, for example. And they would set up a radio station in order for there to be a good or a reason that you would buy this receiver. And so in the 20s, you had a variety of different types of radio show that were, most of them weren't the kind of model we have today where there's commercials and things like this. It wasn't ad-supported radio. And there was a lot of debates about what radio would be. By the end of the 1920s, you begin to see the commercial model that we have today emerging. This was really controversial, though, at the time, because there had been a big group of people who thought that radio should have been used for educational purposes and for uplift. And even the people who were pioneering this new commercial form of radio were very cautious about it. They were very concerned not to have too many advertisements or too crass an advertisement, because the whole idea of a commercially supported mass medium that was received in the kind of sanctity of the home, the domestic sphere, was really understood by everybody to be controversial, which I think is surprising today because this is just what broadcasting is to us. So in the 1930s, this was a really, really new thing. The idea that news and culture was being brought to you through this kind of very self-evidently commercial format. And so this is part of the backbone of the debates about radio in the 1930s, the fact that this commercial nature of radio was quite controversial.
And so initially the programming was by the radio manufacturers, but then broadcasters and others saw this as a new channel to reach consumers and citizens, and then started creating their own content, right?
Yes. So you had in the 20s, you would have equipment manufacturers, but also church groups, universities, newspapers often had radios. You had a lot of different owner-operated stations. But yeah, increasingly in the 1930s, you had larger and larger chains of broadcasters. You had the beginnings of NBC, CBS, the first radio networks, and they produced content that they then shared with all their affiliates. And in fact, often they didn't actually produce the content, but advertising agencies or the sponsoring company would actually produce the content for them. So this is part of the kind of the way that the industry worked in the 1930s.
What was the mix of content as CBS, NBC, and others got into it?
Well, especially NBC had this practice of having both kind of more educative or uplifting material, or what they considered uplifting material, and sponsored material. So they tried to kind of balance it out. But across the 1930s, it's trending more and more toward, if it wasn't going to be commercially viable, it wasn't going to be on the air. The idea of commercial radio is being accepted by politicians and by Americans. And so the need for sustaining or the kind of what was understood as quality programming was no longer as emphasized.
Right. I'd imagine that President Franklin Roosevelt probably helped drive the growth of radio with his fireside chats, because that was a very new thing for a U.S. president to do.
It was. It was a very new thing for a U.S. president to do, and a very canny thing to do. So one of the things that he did with radio, even before the fireside chats, was he spoke directly to the American people without having to deal with the gatekeepers in the newspapers. And most of the newspapers at the time were not for Roosevelt. They were anti-Roosevelt. So this was really important to him to kind of woo the radio and use radio to reach out to the American people. So this was a very important thing, in a way in which there are many parallels between the use of Twitter by many different personalities and radio at the time. So he used radio to reach directly to people. It was understood to be a pretty populist medium. And also, when he started to do the fireside chats, one of the really distinctive things about them is the way he spoke to the American population. He spoke in very folksy terms, he didn't use jargon. He spoke in a very kind of intimate, colloquial tone. People felt like they were speaking with the president. So it was a really common tool for campaigning. And when you go back and look at some of the early radio regulation, it's clear that they're thinking about the fact that politicians are using radio as a direct means of address to the American people. And how this would work would be, you wouldn't necessarily be speaking across like NBC, CBS to the American people. If you were Roosevelt, you would be, you'd hold a press conference and you would be speaking to these giant networks. But for a smaller politician who was doing more regional politics, you might be speaking on a local independent station. Right. You might purchase time. So people were using radio in a lot of different ways. One of the interesting things that emerged in this, and this is some of the research I'm doing on my new book on free speech and media technologies, is that this raised questions about who was the liable speaker. If say a politician on the air libeled somebody, or anybody on air libeled somebody, because the station owner and operator was different sometimes from the person who was actually saying things over the air. And often this was they weren't invited people, but they were paying. There was like a toll call. They were paying to actually make this address to the audience. And so in legal cases, you have this attempt to define who is responsible for libel over the radio. And there's this very real puzzlement over who's going to be responsible. Is it the person who is actually speaking? Is it the host, say, who's interviewing them? Is it the technicians who could have pulled the plug on the broadcast at any time? Or is it the license holder who's probably also the owner of the station? The inconclusiveness of this results in a set of practices at a lot of different radio stations where the owners and operators don't know if they're going to be sued for libel and if they're going to be held responsible. So people coming on the air have to submit statements, like written scripts of what they're going to say before they can go on the air, so it can be approved, so that the license holders feel a little more secure about their liability, that they're not going to get in trouble for anything.
So how did that evolve then?
There's actually a case in the late 20s or early 30s in Nebraska that involves this type of a political speech on air, where the license holder was held responsible. The libel was understood to be both the actual speaker and the station owner. So they both end up having to pay for this damages for the libel. And this sets a precedent that of kind of fuzzy boundaries of responsibility that lasts until the 50s or the 60s, when this gets ironed out a little bit more in a little bit more of a rigorous fashion that allows everyone to kind of know what their responsibility is. But for all the years in between, that's when you have these practices of kind of informal. Each station has its own rules about how they're going to kind of curb their bets or, CYA about liability. And a lot of this is this, we're going to really vet people before they go on. We are going to make people submit everything to us in writing. And it may have contributed as well to some of the types of rules that a lot of broadcasters had about controversial speech and activities, where any kind of controversial speech was often, there were policies saying there would be no controversial speech. So it was, in a sense, banned at a lot of different radio stations.
Yeah, so obviously the parallel to today's world with Twitter, Facebook, and Google, each platform sets their own policies of what's acceptable and what's not. If you take InfoWars and Alex Jones as an example, initially Facebook and Google banned him, but Twitter did not until just recently. So it seems similar, some parallels between radio during the time and what some of the social media platforms are struggling with today. Did his message then just get lost, or did he come up with another way to get his voice heard?
Yeah, I think that there's several interesting and telling or useful parallels. And this is a difference, I guess I would say, between the platforms today and radio in the 1930s. And radio at the time, by the way, as a sort of an aside, radio was talked about as a platform, and there was a lot of back and forth about, was radio more of just a platform for the speech of others, or was it an editorial outlet for the views of the owner? And so there was a lot of back and forth about this in the 30s, and the libel laws and the inconclusivity of the libel laws is part of this kind of we're not sure what type of technology this is. And it felt very Wild West to those involved in it, but it did all get ironed out or institutionalized. And so these rules these roles were solidified and rules were solidified. And I think that probably we'll see some of that in the next decade with social media. Like, I think that there's some parallels between the way that we are having a difficult time figuring out if Facebook is a technology or whether it is a news outlet, that type of thing. I think radio had a lot of the same ambiguities at the time. In the 1930s and 1940s, radio tended to be quite shy of controversial speech for a variety of reasons. There were often explicit rules about not allowing controversial speakers. In the 30s, this often meant labor, and liberals and labor activists were quite upset about this. And it wasn't the state that labor needed to worry about so much as it was these radio stations that were censoring their speech. And so this was the kind of backlash against this in the early 30s. And there was a sense that the speech of labor was being unfairly targeted. This went both ways, though, by the end of the decade.
Going back to labor unions and the struggle in getting their voice heard, did they undertake similar tactics with more editorial, or did they have better success on radio?
Yeah, there was a lot of writing. So there's a lot of editorials, a lot of advocacy in the newspapers, but they also did a lot of litigation. And, obviously also picketing and strikes is one of the things they're doing. And some of the litigation is over the ability to, or they're involved with some of the radio litigation about, advocating or accusing certain radio networks of, and I'm trying to remember some of the facts of the cases here, of like NBC and CBS networks for being monopolists and, not giving them space to speak. And again, this also sounds kind of familiar with some of the talks about, some of the talk about Google being a monopolist and its free speech implications, but also being involved with litigation about the ability to picket and things like this. So a lot of their agitation there. So there's a lot of turning to print, but there's also a lot of use of court cases to establish rights. And one of the big outcomes of this is in 1939 in Hague v. CIO, the Supreme Court establishes the public forum and says that city streets and city parks are places, physical places where everyone should speak.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways these places were talked about were platforms. These were platforms for the working man or platforms for the poor.
Mm-hmm.
And they were meant as an outlet, since these voices were having trouble accessing the privately owned platforms of the newspaper and the radio, that the city, municipalities, public places needed to operate as platforms so that labor and other, causes associated with people without means had a space, had a channel to speak on. So the public forum law is very much wrapped up in concerns about media concentration and private censorship in the 1930s and 40s.
At what point did radio become more open, where labor or other voices could be heard through a radio channel?
Criticizing business or capitalism was also always something that was hard to do. In the 1940s, though, you had the establishment of a fairness doctrine and various other policies, the efforts of the FCC to try to make sure that radio gave more of a voice to everyone, right? And it's partly in response to this advocacy in the 30s and trying to make sure that at least two sides of every issue get aired, and is trying to force radio to operate and TV to operate a bit more like a common carrier. Not fully like a common carrier, but a bit more like that, like a platform where we're going to at least have different spokespeople for different sides of an issue on it. And that lasted for a while. It really started to recede in the 70s and was killed in the 90s. The other thing that I would add on to clarify on that question is, radio and television were not as business driven in the 30s or as profit driven, especially in the news divisions, as they are today. Starting in the 80s, you began to see the idea that you began to see profit divisions or profit being the primary rationale in more aspects of media than were previously. Obviously, profit was always a very, very important thing. But when we look at media history, we often note the way in which broadcasters used to also have a sense that they were also cultural institutions, and they had a various public interest. They had to serve the public interest. They had a little bit of a public servant role, especially in their news divisions. And that has gradually sort of waned. It's not gone, but it has waned or has transformed.
As you continue to look at this and use radio as a historical example to understand and use, what are the lessons learned, and what might platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Google take to heart from history?
Well, one of the things that I take away right now is looking back, reading the newspapers, reading documents from the 30s, I can see how unsettled people were and how unsettling radio was. And in a way that I think right now social media are very unsettling politically to most of us, and how people were very afraid that the audience might be easily duped. These often greedy or self-interested hucksters or political speakers on the air arose in the 30s and seemed to have quite this effect, and people thought quite a large effect, and people thought that politics were transforming for good. They didn't in many ways. In some ways they did, but in many ways they did not. And what I take from this is the sense that right now we may be living through a period of flux, interesting times that you don't want to live in, right?
Right.
And that people are responding to social media with a set of norms and assumptions and modes of reading and listening that are honed on older media. And maybe in a decade, we will respond and react differently. We will have kind of developed our ways of understanding what a true and false claim is in new media and in social media. These are the things that give me some hope. And I think, well, okay, we've seen these moments of great fluctuation and great uncertainty and transformation in the past. And things did not completely fall apart. So people did kind of develop new ways of listening and understanding when somebody was a duplicitous speaker. And the worst abusers of radio as a new medium were all in the early 30s. We're all in the 30s. And so those worst abuses happened at the very beginning, and it became a less volatile, politically volatile space after that. So that's something that I see as being hopeful.
So there's a role for listeners and a responsibility in helping settle the unsettling times as well.
Yeah, and I don't think that it was, listeners individually getting smarter necessarily. It wasn't only critical literacy, but the development of genres and norms and these things that kind of happen collectively. And I think that helps. And also different new institutions or new institutions that are kind of acting either as gatekeepers or proxies for trust, new ways of understanding how you trust speakers in these new mediums, which have to do both with the credentials of who's speaking, but also with genres and ways of speaking and courting trust in this new medium.
That's fascinating. What a wonderful conversation, and very appropriate in looking at the history of radio and how it applies to our times today. Any closing thoughts or takeaways for our listeners?
I would say the takeaway is, one of the big takeaways is, that, new media are always disruptive, and most likely things will flatten out to some extent.
Well, Professor Jennifer Petersen, thank you so much for your time. Look forward to your new book, How Machines Came to Speak. What's your target release on your new book?
Well, academic publishing's a little slow. The book will be done this year, but that means probably going for a 2020 or 2021 release date.
Well, again, thank you so much for your time. You've given us a lot to think about, as well as sort through in how we use the Wild West of social media and potentially tame it through how we listen, but also giving us hope for some of the institutions to help us through it as well.
Thank you.
Listeners, we'd love to hear from you. Can you think of other parallels between radio and social media? How would you like to see social media continue to evolve, personally or through our institutions? Send your perspective to me at john@activateworld.com. That's John without an H, Jon @activateworld.com. Write it out or record it. Send it my way. We want to hear and share your thoughts. Be sure to tell your friends and colleagues about the Activate World podcast. Encourage them to subscribe, listen, and share from their favorite podcast platform, Apple, Google, Spotify, and others. Let us know how we're doing by leaving a review. Your reviews mean a lot to us. And join us next time as we talk to the research team from MIT Labs who explored social media polarization. Activate World is a team endeavor. Special thanks to Kayla Waldstein and Kent Nutt. Music by Jason Goodyear. For Activate World, I'm John Mertz.